Close your eyes and follow the sound of a world slowly unraveling as kingdoms falter, friendships strain, and decisions echo through the tangled weave of fate. Let your mind drift now gently, like a solitary raven gliding above the war-torn valleys of Temeria, through the silent forests of Cerdwen, and over the frost-bitten peaks of Aedion. This is not a story of heroes in shining armor, nor of villains cloaked in darkness. It is a tale of choices, quiet, irreversible choices, made not in the brilliance of glory, but in the hushed corridors of doubt and necessity. The world is tired, the swords are heavy, and the path ahead, worn thin by the weary boots of consequence. Tonight, we begin the first of 17 long chapters. Let the stillness settle in and breathe slowly as we begin the first murmured tale from the world of The Witcher 2, Assassins of Kings. It began, as such stories often do, not with thunder or clamour, but with the low murmur of gathering intentions. The siege of La Valette Castle, etched into memory not for its chaos, but for the quiet deliberation that preceded every blade drawn and every life extinguished, marked the opening of a long and tangled journey. The air was thick that morning, not only with the smoke of distant cook fires or the scent of wet stone, but with the soft weight of inevitability. Soldiers moved in precise, practiced formations across the field, their armor not gleaming, but dulled by mud and wear. For this was not a battle to inspire, but one to endure. Geralt of Rivia, the White Wolf, found himself once again where he never asked to be, at the edge of a royal quarrel, wrapped in the politics of men who demanded loyalty, but offered little truth. He stood in the tent of King Foltest, the war-weary ruler of Temeria, who in his final days would speak in measured tones, never hurried, never kind. This siege was not just against walls, but against history, against inheritance, against the very fabric of a fractured land. Foltest's illegitimate children, Anais and Bussy, held within the castle, were less hostages than pawns in a slow game of lineage and perception. The king sought legitimacy, not just of crown, but of blood, and he tasked Geralt not with conquest, but with closure. As the cannons rumbled softly in the distance, more felt than heard. Geralt listened without truly listening. He had heard the same words before. A monarch needing help, a contract without coin, an order cloaked in civility but driven by desperation. So he nodded, slowly, silently, and prepared to climb once more through the echoes of war. The assault was methodical, not ferocious. Every stair climbed within the castle was met not with resistance, but with resignation. The guards fought with the rhythm of those who knew they could not win, yet had no place left to retreat. Steel clanged against steel in distant chambers, but even the cries of pain were muted, as though muffled by time itself. Geralt's mind wandered, as it often did when surrounded by death. He thought of Kaer Morhen, the snow-covered fortress of his youth, where the wind whispered through broken halls and memory lay heavy like frost. He thought of Yennefer, a ghost in his thoughts, her voice lost to time, her scent lingering like lavender pressed between forgotten pages. Yet he remained in the present, sword drawn, boots treading the soaked stone of the La Valette keep, until at last, the moment of stillness. The chamber was quiet, the children found, and King Foltest stood proud, if only for a moment. It was in that moment, still, solemn, soft, that the blade struck. Not a roar, not a struggle, just the sound of steel through flesh, and a single breath cut short. The king fell, and Geralt, eyes wide, saw the face of the assassin vanish through the window like a shadow devoured by light. He did not shout, he did not run. He stood in silence, for the noise of that death would echo not in the ears, but in the heart. Framed for the murder, Geralt's path twisted further, not by his own will, but by the hands of others, those who drew maps of loyalty with broken lines and cracked ink. Thus began the unravelling, not just of a man's name, but of a continent's quiet equilibrium. The forest, dense and slow with damp air and clinging fog, wrapped itself around Geralt like an old, reluctant friend. Trees, ancient and gnarled, stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of centuries, as if they, too, remembered the blood that had been spilled in their shade. The path to Flotsam was neither swift nor kind, but it was constant. Every step forward crunched upon fallen leaves and bones of forgotten creatures, both man and beast. Geralt moved quietly, accompanied not only by the rustling trees, but by the low, slow voices of those who followed. Vernon Roche, loyal to Temeria, loyal to Foltest, loyal even to vengeance. And Triss Merigold, her words soft, often trailing off, as if caught between thought and memory. Their presence did not comfort. It merely filled the space. The sun, obscured by clouds, cast no shadows, only an even grey, a ceaseless tone of colourlessness, dulled the land. And as the group descended into the outskirts of Flotsam, they were greeted not by welcome, but by suspicion. A village worn thin by fear and survival, ruled more by trade than by trust. Flotsam was not a city, nor even a town in the truest sense. It was a collection of buildings held together by debt, liquor, and superstition, a place where the forest threatened to swallow homes whole, where the townsfolk whispered not in prayer, but in warning. Here, monsters were not merely creatures from deep caves or swamps, but men twisted by opportunity, corrupted by coin, and aged before their time. The guards, their armour rusted and eyes weary, stood beside stockades not as protectors, but as watchers. Behind them, Lorito, the local commandant, smiled in the way that merchants do when coin outweighs morality. He offered no sanctuary, only scrutiny. To him, Geralt was not a guest, but an investment, a variable to be weighed, and perhaps discarded. And yet, in Flotsam, even discomfort could become familiar. Contracts appeared swiftly. A Kairan, an ancient, tentacled beast, had stirred in the river, disrupting trade routes and swallowing entire vessels whole. The villagers told their tale with the rhythm of those who expected to be ignored. But Geralt listened, as he always did, not for drama, but for detail. He studied the signs, the slime, the broken ships, the half-told stories, each small clue layered upon the next, until a picture formed not of chaos, but of pattern. For monsters rarely act without reason, and the Kairan, ancient and patient, was not driven by hunger, but by disturbance. Something had shifted. Something had trespassed. Preparations were slow. There was no rush. Ingredients needed gathering. Equipment needed mending. Time passed, as the wind carried distant cries from the woods. Screams or echoes, it was never clear. Every action led to another. Potions brewed by soft candlelight. Sword oil mixed in silence. A net, weighted and fragile, designed for a creature that did not forgive mistakes. And then, the confrontation. The river, still and wide, became a mirror for the sky. Mist rolled from its surface like breath, heavy and constant. The Kairan emerged not with fury, but inevitability. Tentacles, slick and thick with the mud of centuries, lashed the banks, pulling stone and soil into water. There was no music, no battle cry, only the slow, meticulous rhythm of dodges, strikes, repositions. Geralt moved like water, without haste, without pause. The beast screeched once, a sound so low it vibrated through ribs and sinew, and then it fell. Its weight, tremendous, folded into the river like a sunken cathedral. Silence returned, but Flotsam did not celebrate. It simply continued. Yet beneath the town's dull surface another tension simmered. Iorveth, the elf, the rebel, the ghost of a dying people, moved through the forest like a shadow never quite caught. His Scoia'tael, driven not by conquest, but by retaliation, struck trade routes and torch-burned caravans. The humans called them terrorists. The elves called them memories. Geralt, caught as ever between two worlds, listened more than he spoke. Triss warned of danger, Roche warned of betrayal. And still, Geralt watched. He watched as the town pretended stability, as Lorito tightened his grip, as secrets unraveled slowly, like rope fraying beneath unseen weight. And then, the choice. To pursue Iorveth, or to remain aligned with Roche. Each decision, slow in its formation, bore the weight of nations. To side with Roche was to remain loyal to human order, to martial law, and to vengeance with borders. To side with Iorveth was to understand grief, older than the walls of Flotsam, a pain sharpened across generations. Geralt did not rush. He never did. And when the moment arrived, the silence said more than words. The path chosen would define not only the days to come, but the very structure of the world itself. Forked, fractured, formed anew. As the boat departed from Flotsam's dock, cutting slowly through the wide, sluggish Vaad, the mountains loomed not as conquerors, but as guardians, stoic, unchanging, carved by wind and time, indifferent to the footsteps of man and elf alike. Within their jagged cradle rested Vergen, a fortress town not born from ambition, but from necessity. Stone walls, veined with moss and soot, rose from the earth as if summoned by history itself, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of hands, weapons, and weather. Geralt approached slowly, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots muffled by a thin veil of fog. The journey had not been swift, nor easy, for the roads through Aedirn were patrolled by more than soldiers. Rumours spoke of wraiths among the passes, of phantoms whose chains clattered in the wind, and of spirits that lingered where wars once burned too brightly. Yet such murmurs for the Witcher were familiar, background noise in a life composed of quiet tragedies. Vergen's gates opened not with fanfare, but with caution. The guards, clad in mismatched armor and bearing the faces of men long deprived of peace, regarded Geralt with wary eyes. They had heard of him, of course. a witcher, a kingslayer, a monster to some, a necessity to others. Yet here, in the depths of Edin's resistance, reputation held less weight than purpose. Zoltan Shive the dwarf met him with a nod rather than a greeting. Old friends required no ceremony. Their bond, formed in fire and blood, needed no words to sustain it. Together they ascended the narrow steps into the heart of Vergen, where the scent of iron mingled with smoke, and the echoes of hammers rang like distant thunder. At the town centre stood Saskia, the dragon slayer, the virgin of Aedin, a figure wrapped not in armour alone, but in legend. She was young, by the standards of warlords and monarchs, but her gaze held a weight that belied her years. She did not speak with charisma, but with clarity. Her words cut not with sharpness, but with precision. She did not ask for loyalty. She earned it through steadiness. She sought unity, Edin's freedom from the tightening noose of northern kingdoms, an alliance between humans, dwarves, and elves. And Geralt, ever the reluctant participant in grand designs, listened, his silence a vessel for judgment. Yet peace, even in a place built from shared struggle, proved elusive. For Vergen, like all places, carried its shadows. Beneath the stone, tunnels twisted in forgotten directions, old mines, abandoned and cursed, breathed whispers of rot fiends and arakas. Contracts were offered, not with urgency, but with inevitability. The townsfolk, stoic and grim, placed their fears on parchment, left upon the notice board like offerings to a silent god. Geralt descended into those depths with measured tread. The monsters, predictable in their hunger, met him in the flickering torchlight. Steel found flesh. Igni met darkness. Yet even these familiar battles left no satisfaction. Only a dull ache in limbs that had long grown tired of the same gestures. And above, the war brewed. Kedwin's forces, led by the cold and calculating King Henselt, pressed at the borders. His ambition was not loud, but methodical. Every inch of land, every hill and valley was weighed against a map drawn in blood. Vergen stood in defiance, not because it was strong, but because it was stubborn. Geralt, as ever, stood between the lines, between sides, between truths. He wandered through the marketplace where merchants whispered of spies, through the alehouses where songs once sung of courage now turned to laments, through the healer's tent where Triss's absence was keenly felt, for she had vanished, taken, lost, or worse. Somewhere between the threads of magic and treachery, and all the while the ghostly mist encroached, for across the battlefield a curse lingered, not a simple hex, but a powerful living thing, a magical anomaly born of rage, desperation, and ancient sorcery. The mist pulsed, separating armies, consuming scouts, swallowing patrols. Within it roamed the fallen, spectral knights reliving battles unending, their souls shackled by betrayal and fire. To cross the mist, one required protection. To break the curse, one required knowledge. Geralt sought both. He gathered fragments of memory, visions, relics, names spoken only in secret. He pieced together a puzzle centuries old, layer by layer, word by word. Conversations turned to confessions. Confessions turned to clues. And the truth, when uncovered, proved neither grand nor cruel, but simply tired. The curse broke not with a blast, but with a hush, and in its place silence reigned again. Yet the battle resumed. Caedwini steel met Edirnian resistance. Arrows darkened the sky. Siege engines groaned like ancient beasts. Blood flowed between stones. Saskia stood firm, her blade unshaking, and when the dust settled, the town still stood, but at a cost, for Saskia was not as she seemed. The revelation came softly. She was no mere warrior. She was a dragon, enchanted, concealed. The river flowed gently through the valley, its surface still, reflecting only the grey sky above, neither dark nor bright, but suspended in an eternal dusk. Time passed differently near the battlefield. Sounds were muffled by the mist that lingered long after the fighting ceased. The trees bordering the water leaned in as if listening, their leaves barely rustling, their roots steeped in memories. Geralt of Rivia arrived at the edge of that fog, not with urgency, but with quiet resolve. The air was heavy, not from weather, but from weight, of decisions not yet made, of truths not yet spoken, of ghosts not yet released. King Henselt awaited beyond the veil, the monarch of Caedwin, rigid in posture, his gaze stern not with cruelty, but with the burden of rule. His soldiers bore the marks of a long campaign, sullied cloaks, tired hands, eyes that had seen too much and yet dared to hope for something more. The mist, however, cared little for crowns or crests. It persisted. It moved like a living thing, curling around tents and spears, whispering in low tones that even the bravest men could not interpret. Those who ventured into it rarely returned whole. Some came back with blank eyes and trembling hands. Others did not return at all. The curse, once a mystery, had now become a fixture, something understood only in fragments, in quiet conversations held in the hours before dawn. A battle, long forgotten by history, had replayed itself in endless loops. Wraiths of once proud knights fought against one another, reliving betrayal, slaughter, and failure. Their pain never eased, their purpose never fulfilled. Geralt listened. He always listened. He walked with deliberate steps, crossing the border between living and dead, between present and past. Within the mist, the world shifted. Colours dulled. Time slowed. Sounds echoed not from their sources, but from memory. The ghosts appeared not as monsters, but as soldiers, confused, lost, seeking absolution. They swung swords of mist and flame, shouting names of commanders long gone. Their cries were not of anger, but of despair. Each encounter was a plea, each attack a question left unanswered. Geralt defended himself not with fury, but with patience. His blade, silver and silent, cut through illusions, through bindings, through forgotten oaths. With each fallen spectre, the fog thinned, slowly. Outside the mist, King Henselt watched. He was not a kind man, but he was not a villain. He was simply a ruler, shaped by cold winters, narrow victories, and court whispers. His world was one of lines drawn on parchment, of alliances made not from trust, but from fear. He saw in Geralt not a threat, but a tool. And tools, once useful, are kept close until they break. Their conversations were quiet, transactional. Geralt offered solutions, Henselt offered protection, but between the words there lingered something else, an understanding that power has no loyalty. The camp, though filled with noise, was deeply silent in truth. Fires crackled, sentries paced, messengers moved from tent to tent, but all of it, the orders, the strategies, the preparations, felt distant, as if occurring beneath a thin layer of ice. Philippa Eilhart, the sorceress, remained near Henselt. Her presence was constant but subdued, like a shadow that never fell the same way twice. She watched, always. Her silence carried weight, heavier than speeches. Her motives, though cloaked, could be felt, pushing, guiding, manipulating. And then came the dream. Geralt, in sleep, wandered through the battlefield once more. The cries were louder there, the faces clearer. Among the dead, he saw himself, not bleeding, but waiting, not fallen, but still. And across from him stood the assassin, not one man, but many, not one motive, but layers. Letho, the Kingslayer. Muscles coiled, voice low, loyalty hidden behind every glance. Their paths had diverged, yet were tied by a purpose neither fully understood. And still, they moved toward one another like magnets in fog, bound by past deeds and future necessities. Awakening brought no clarity, only more steps to take, more ghosts to free. The curse's heart was unearthed not through strength, but through remembrance. Names forgotten by books, deeds never recorded, found voice through Geralt's patience. The key to breaking the cycle was not violence, but understanding. The final spectre, an armored knight, face twisted by sorrow rather than rage, stood atop a ridge. His story, told in fragments, revealed betrayal. A brother in arms turned traitor, a queen misled, a truth lost beneath vengeance. Geralt listened. He always listened. When the spirit fell, the mist receded, not with wind, but with stillness. The air lightened. The sun, dull and pale, broke through for a single moment, and the soldiers, weary and wounded, stepped forward once more. But peace remained distant. King Henselt, though grateful, was unchanged. His ambitions stretched westward, his distrust deepened. The wind had changed, not abruptly, not violently, but with the quiet, creeping shift that one only notices in retrospect, like a subtle chill in the room, or the faint taste of iron on the tongue. Across the northern kingdoms, the pieces began to stir, not through armies, but through voices, not on the battlefield, but behind closed doors, beneath chandeliers dimmed by age, in towers that reached above the clouds, yet were filled with silence. The Lodge of Sorceresses had existed not as a council of war, but as an arrangement of intention. Formed from necessity, sustained through secrecy, it operated in whispers, each member speaking carefully, deliberately, as if afraid of their own echo. Philippa Eilhart, tall, composed, unblinking, moved among them like a shadow, always slightly misaligned. Her loyalties, like her sentences, often ran parallel to truth without ever directly touching it. She was not cruel, only cold. She did not demand power. She simply positioned herself to receive it. Others, too, sat at that long and dimly lit table. Cille de Tansarville, cloaked in detachment, calculating each phrase like a spell, Francesca fin de Bailly, ancient even among elves, wore her wisdom like a garment too heavy for the present day. Kira Metz, young among them, spoke with eagerness that often unravelled into careful quiet, and yet none trusted the others, not truly, for the lodge was formed not of friendship, but of alignment. Each sorceress held her own plan, her own leverage, her own small cache of secrets. They saw kingdoms not as homes, but as pieces on a board, monarchs as necessary but temporary. Magic, to them, was not merely art or tool, but the axis upon which order should turn. Geralt, though never a member of their circle, had long stood on its edge, observed, manipulated, resisted. His name passed among their conversations like a variable in an equation too complex to resolve. And Saskia, the dragon, the symbol, the weapon, was central to their design. Her enchantment, cast with precision by Philippa, ensured obedience without awareness. Saskia believed herself free, but each speech, each battle, each decision she made had been guided by an invisible thread. Geralt learned this not through confrontation, but through observation. He watched Philippa's gestures. He recalled her omissions. He listened to the way silence followed certain questions. And slowly, the truth unravelled, not as a revelation, but as a confirmation of all the doubts that had quietly gathered. To confront the lodge directly was impossible. To dismantle its web required patience, and a path lined with choices none could make cleanly. Geralt sought answers not through challenge, but through exploration. He visited libraries long sealed, scrolls that had not been touched for decades. He questioned sorcerers exiled for asking the wrong questions. He walked through cities where statues of mages had been torn down by mobs who feared what they could not name. And still, the lodge tightened its hold. They moved across the north not with soldiers, but with suggestions. Kings signed decrees with hands gently guided. Nobles shifted allegiance under the influence of illusions they mistook for clarity. Every whisper bore the lodge's influence, even if it wore another name. But even among them, trust eroded. Sile began to question Philippa's endgame. Francesca, ever haunted by the fate of her people, saw the lodge's purpose as diverging from that of the elves. And others, sensing the fragility of their alliance, began retreating into silence. And in that silence, plans unravelled. Philippa's grip on Saskia faltered. The spell, never fully stable, began to crack under the weight of the dragon's growing self-awareness. Memories surfaced, fragments of wings, of fire, of skies viewed from above rather than from beneath. Saskia's body remained human, but her soul began to stir. Geralt faced a choice, quiet and absolute. To free Saskia was to defy Philippa, to shatter the carefully laid plans of the lodge, to risk chaos. But to do nothing was to leave power in the hands of those who never earned it. And so he sought the dagger, not a weapon of steel, but of magic, the key to unlocking what had been bound. It lay buried beneath layers of protection, guarded by golems, illusions, riddles. Geralt passed each test not with brute force, but with the soft persistence of someone accustomed to long roads and longer consequences. When at last he stood before Saskia, the spell unravelling, she did not scream. She did not strike. She merely stood, blinking, remembering. The lodge had fractured, its web torn. But from the edges, others watched. And far in the south, Nilfgaard stirred. He moved through the world like a shadow, but not one born of darkness. Rather, he was the shadow of choices made by others, of wars begun without consent, of rulers crowned and uncrowned by the silent weight of history. His name was Letho of Gulet, though few ever knew it. Fewer still understood what it meant. Letho was not a spectre. He bled, he aged, he slept. Yet in the eyes of kings and spies alike, he became myth, a ghost that walked in broad daylight, unflinching, methodical, and quiet. His path was not chosen freely, but neither was it imposed. It was accepted, as one accepts gravity, as one accepts silence after war. Geralt, ever the unwilling participant in grand designs, had followed the trail across scorched earth and bloodied parchment, across reports, rumours, and quiet confessions. Every clue left behind by the Kingslayer did not scream, but whispered. Every death calculated, every disappearance deliberate. Letho had slain Demavend. He had stood over Foltest's broken body, and still he had not vanished. He walked through the world like someone immune to consequence, not because he was untouchable, but because he had already accepted the price. Their stories intertwined not by fate, but by design. Long ago, both had trained at Kaer Morhen, though at different times. Both had endured the trial of the grasses, had held swords before ever holding beliefs. Both had learned to walk alone, never belonging, never resting. Yet where Geralt questioned, Letho executed. Where Geralt hesitated, Letho completed the contract. And this mission, was no mere string of murders. It was a message, not to the north, but from the south. Nilfgaard, quiet for a time, rebuilding beneath black banners and long shadows, had returned not with armies first, but with subtlety. The Emperor, Emir var Emreis, known by many names, had seen what others missed, that power could be taken without being seized, that if the North consumed itself from within, there would be little left to conquer. Letho was their instrument, yet he was not a puppet. He had demands, negotiations, protections. He had been promised the restoration of the Viper School, promised a future, and in the ruins of each assassination, he believed he was building something more than chaos. He believed he was clearing the path for structure, order, a better lie to live in. When Geralt finally caught up to him, there were no grand speeches, no drawn swords, only two men, once cut from the same stone, now shaped by different winds, standing across a dying fire. They spoke quietly of the past, of choices, of what it means to be used. Letho, slow in speech, deliberate in thought, explained the truth without apology. He killed because it was necessary, because kings had become fragile things, moved too easily, corrupted too quickly. His actions were not personal, they were surgical, removing the rot so that something else, stronger perhaps, might grow. Geralt did not argue. He only asked, "What comes next?" And Letho, after a pause, replied, "Nothing if we fail, but maybe something else if we don't." There was no threat between them, only recognition and a choice. To kill Letho was to draw a clear line, to say that certain actions, regardless of intent, had consequences that must be faced. To let him live was to accept that sometimes, in the great churn of kingdoms and fates, justice is not an absolute, but a choice, dressed as understanding. Geralt stood silent, the sword at his side untouched, and the fire between them died out slowly, ember by ember, until there was only night, no victory, no punishment, only continuation. Later, as he walked alone again, the stars dim behind a veil of thin clouds, Geralt remembered no words from their meeting, only the feeling, heavy and slow, that sometimes the greatest monsters are not those with fangs, but those with convictions. Thrones, whether carved from oak or forged from iron, were never comfortable. They were built not for rest, but for presence, for elevation, intimidation and permanence. Yet in truth, no throne ever lasted. Every king eventually fell. Every court changed hands, and every crown tarnished, slowly, inevitably, as if the weight of power itself corroded all that touched it. In the northern kingdoms, thrones were as numerous as ambitions, each one backed by lineage, coin, or blood. But behind every throne, always without exception, stood a knife. Sometimes that knife took the form of a noble, patient and smiling, biding time behind well-rehearsed manners. Sometimes it was a mage, whispering carefully chosen words in candle-lit chambers. And sometimes it was a blade in the dark, literal and sudden, answering only to coin or cause. The death of King Foltest had not been the beginning, nor was it the end. It was simply the latest ripple in a pool long unsettled. Geralt, once again drawn into the ripple, now moved among rulers not as an equal, but as a complication, respected by some, feared by others, understood by none. In Temeria, a power vacuum had formed. Without a clear heir, factions stirred. Barons sought influence. Merchants courted new alliances. The nobles whispered of unity, but plotted division. The land, already wounded by war and politics, bled further beneath the surface. Elsewhere, in Redania, King Radovid prepared not merely for war, but for control. Young and brilliant, he had been forged by loss and vengeance. His mind, sharp and cold, saw not people, but positions. His hands held not just weapons, but destinies. He distrusted sorcerers, admired order, and valued silence. Every decision was calculated, not for today, but for 100 tomorrows. Radovid's court was quiet, not from peace, but from fear. Those who spoke carelessly did not remain. Those who maneuvered poorly vanished. He played a long game, a careful game, one in which even allies were temporary. To him, the Lodge of Sorceresses was not a partner, but a threat cloaked in velvet and perfume. In Cedwyn, King Hensel's grip remained strong but strained. The scars of recent battles marked more than land. His army remained large, his gaze uncompromising, but unrest brewed beneath the surface, among the peasants, among the soldiers, even among his advisors. The world around him was changing, and though he resisted it, the tide was rising. And in Erden, Saskia's dual identity, once hidden, now became a point of contention. Some revered her even more, seeing the dragon as a divine protector. Others questioned her right to rule, calling her a threat to order. The rebellion she once led with clarity now splintered, its cohesion dependent not on belief, but on necessity. Through all this, Geralt moved, not as an emissary, but as an observer. He travelled from court to court, from encampment to capital, hearing the same phrases repackaged, for the good of the realm, for the people, for the future. Each throne he approached bore its own knife, and each king or queen its own fears. At courtly gatherings, Geralt often stood at the edge of candlelight, unmoving, silent, overlooked by those who measured worth in titles and coin. But he listened to the servants, whose gossip spoke truth unfiltered, to the guards, whose fatigue betrayed the shape of the times, to the scribes, whose careful records missed only what mattered. He witnessed treaties written in ink and broken in blood. He saw lords swear loyalty while hiding letters of betrayal. He watched as executions were staged to maintain control, not deliver justice. And he saw the lodge, fragmented but not defeated, move like a current beneath it all. Sorceresses who had once ruled through subtlety now acted through desperation. Their influence, though reduced, had not vanished. They still whispered in royal ears, still shaped events not through war, but through misdirection. Each kingdom feared collapse. Each sought stability through dominance, and in their haste, they sharpened their own downfall. The knives behind the thrones did not tremble. They remained waiting. And Geralt, never drawn by power, never tempted by titles, simply watched, because he understood what others would not accept. That power, once grasped, always costs more than it gives. And in the quiet that follows every coronation, the knife always remains. Sleep, when it came, did not bring rest. It was not peace that greeted Geralt in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, but fragments, images without context, voices without faces, places remembered only through scent and sound. These were not nightmares, for they carried no terror, nor were they dreams, for they lacked freedom. They were memories rearranged, distorted, stitched together by the invisible thread of lost time. The witcher's mind, hardened by potions and discipline, could hold back many things: pain, fatigue, even fear. But dreams, those slipped through like mist through cracks in stone. They came in whispers. They came in silence. He saw Yennefer often. Not clearly. Her face, never fully visible, hovered at the edge of vision. Her voice was the sound of wind across old parchment, soft and unintelligible. Sometimes she laughed, though he could not remember the reason. Sometimes she cried, though he never knew why. And always, just before he reached her, she turned away. These dreams were not new. They had followed him since the wild hunt had taken her, since memory itself had been torn from him like pages burned in the hearth. He had spent years recovering what he could, piecing himself together from scattered impressions, from the reactions of others, from letters unsent, and feelings unexplained. But some things could not be reclaimed. Some chains remained, even if invisible. The Lodge of Sorceresses had seen to that. Philippa Eilhart and her sisters had played their part well, not through cruelty, but through necessity, or so they claimed. The decisions made on his behalf, the memory loss, the manipulation, were always framed as unfortunate but required, sacrifices for a greater good. And still the chains remained, not on his wrists, not on his ankles, but around the moments he could never quite grasp. Triss Merigold, too, appeared in his dreams, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Her presence brought warmth, but also guilt, a gentle, persistent ache that nestled behind every look they had shared, every word they had failed to speak aloud. In waking life, she had been there for him, tender, patient, brave. But even she had made choices on his behalf, choices born of care, choices that nonetheless bound him. In one dream, Geralt stood in a field of ash. The sky above him was colourless. The ground beneath him crunched with burnt leaves. A single tree, tall and dead, stood in the distance, and hanging from its branches were memories, not bodies, not symbols, but sounds and images and scents. A child's laugh, the metallic taste of blood, the scent of lilac and gooseberries. He approached the tree slowly, knowing he could not touch its branches. And when he awoke, the scent still lingered in his nose, like a truth half remembered. Not all dreams were his own. Magic, though distant, still brushed against his thoughts. Sorceresses, those who once knew him intimately, and those who sought only to use him, often reached for him through dreams. They sent visions, suggestions, illusions, and though most failed, some left traces, a word he could not place, a fear that was not his. And far away, beyond dreams, in places where time no longer moved as it should, the wild hunt stirred. They did not haunt him as they once had, but he could still feel them, distantly, like thunder far over the horizon. Their presence was not direct, but inevitable, as if the world itself knew they would return, as if every sleeping hour was but a countdown. In Vergen, Flotsam, and even in Cedwen's cold fortresses, the common people spoke of strange dreams. They saw flames in the north, shadows with no source, stars falling sideways. Some called it prophecy, others madness. Geralt knew better. The world was shifting, not from kings and armies, but from old things, forgotten things, things that did not belong to mortals alone. And dreams, those quiet visitors, were their messengers. So he slept when he could, slowly, carefully. And when he woke, he did not speak of what he saw. For some chains, even when invisible, should not be named. Sleep, when it came, did not bring rest. It was not peace that greeted Geralt in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, but fragments, images without context, voices without faces, places remembered only through scent and sound. These were not nightmares, for they carried no terror, nor were they dreams, for they lacked freedom. They were memories rearranged, distorted, stitched together by the invisible thread of lost time. The witcher's mind, hardened by potions and discipline, could hold back many things: pain, fatigue, even fear. But dreams, those slipped through like mist through cracks in stone. They came in whispers. They came in silence. He saw Yennefer often. Not clearly. Her face, never fully visible, hovered at the edge of vision. Her voice was the sound of wind across old parchment, soft and unintelligible. Sometimes she laughed, though he could not remember the reason. Sometimes she cried, though he never knew why. And always, just before he reached her, she turned away, These dreams were not new. They had followed him since the wild hunt had taken her, since memory itself had been torn from him like pages burned in the hearth. He had spent years recovering what he could, piecing himself together from scattered impressions, from the reactions of others, from letters unsent, and feelings unexplained. But some things could not be reclaimed. Some chains remained, even if invisible. The Lodge of Sorceresses had seen to that. Philippa Eilhart and her sisters had played their part well, not through cruelty, but through necessity, or so they claimed. The decisions made on his behalf, the memory loss, the manipulation, were always framed as unfortunate but required, sacrifices for a greater good. And still the chains remained, not on his wrists, not on his ankles, but around the moments he could never quite grasp. Triss Merigold, too, appeared in his dreams, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Her presence brought warmth, but also guilt, a gentle, persistent ache that nestled behind every look they had shared, every word they had failed to speak aloud. In waking life, she had been there for him, tender, patient, brave. But even she had made choices on his behalf, choices born of care, choices that nonetheless bound him. In one dream, Geralt stood in a field of ash. The sky above him was colourless. The ground beneath him crunched with burnt leaves. A single tree, tall and dead, stood in the distance, and hanging from its branches were memories, not bodies, not symbols, but sounds and images and scents. A child's laugh, the metallic taste of blood, the scent of lilac and gooseberries. He approached the tree slowly, knowing he could not touch its branches. And when he awoke, the scent still lingered in his nose, like a truth half remembered. Not all dreams were his own. Magic, though distant, still brushed against his thoughts. Sorceresses, those who once knew him intimately, and those who sought only to use him, often reached for him through dreams. They sent visions, suggestions, illusions, and though most failed, some left traces, a word he could not place, a fear that was not his. And far away, beyond dreams, in places where time no longer moved as it should, the wild hunt stirred. They did not haunt him as they once had, but he could still feel them, distantly, like thunder far over the horizon. Their presence was not direct, but inevitable, as if the world itself knew they would return, as if every sleeping hour was but a countdown. In Vergen, Flotsam, and even in Cedwen's cold fortresses, the common people spoke of strange dreams. They saw flames in the north, shadows with no source, stars falling sideways. Some called it prophecy, others madness. Geralt knew better. The world was shifting, not from kings and armies, but from old things, forgotten things, things that did not belong to mortals alone. And dreams, those quiet visitors, were their messengers. So he slept when he could, slowly, carefully. And when he woke, he did not speak of what he saw. For some chains, even when invisible, should not be named. The Pontar Valley spread before him in subdued hues, faded greens, tired browns, and the pale grey of morning mist, clinging to the folds of the earth. It was not dramatic terrain, not jagged nor wild, but its quietness was deceptive. For here, more than anywhere, the fate of kingdoms was decided not by the clash of armies, but by footsteps on dirt paths, by glances exchanged between strangers, and by words spoken too softly to ever be recorded. The valley was shared by 3 realms, Eärden, Kedwen, and Temeria. Shared, but never agreed upon. Borders shifted like water through a broken dam, never resting, never satisfying any mapmaker's ink. The valley's people, simple and weary, belonged to none and to all. They tilled the soil in peace when allowed, and bled upon it when told. Geralt stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, his eyes tracing the slow curves of the land, his mind heavy not with urgency, but with the sheer density of what lay below. He had been sent here not as an envoy, but as a witness. Yet in a world as fractured as this, even witnesses became weapons. Each faction saw in him a possibility, a piece on the board, a whisper they could shape, and choices, so many choices, waited. Vergen to the west, rebuilt yet fragile, called to him with the voices of rebels and dreamers. Its stones, still blackened from siege fires, now bore the banners of Saskia's resistance. But the Dragon Lord, no longer bound by magic, had withdrawn from command. Her eyes, once lit by conviction, now carried a weight deeper than sorrow, a knowledge that freedom was not a destination, but a condition under threat. To the east, Hensel's forces held their ground with cold discipline. His camp stood orderly, neat, unfeeling, like a machine that had forgotten why it was built, yet continued to function. Henselt himself waited behind guarded tents, issuing orders with precision, his ambitions unchanged. Between them, smaller powers moved unseen. Scouts, smugglers, informants, minor lords with major grievances. The valley was not still. It only pretended to be. Geralt walked, from village to village, from watchtower to riverbank. The people he met spoke softly, always softly. They feared not just the war, but the choices that came with it. To swear allegiance to the wrong side meant ruin. To stay neutral meant suspicion. To run was to lose everything. At a crossroads near a withered oak, he met a woman whose eyes had no colour left in them. She did not ask for help. She only told a story, of her son taken by conscripts, of her husband killed for refusing to house soldiers, of a home burned not by enemies, but by those who claimed to protect. She did not cry. She had forgotten how. Geralt listened, and then he walked on. Every step became a question. Do you fight for the principled rebel, even knowing her power comes from a truth that breaks the world's sense of order? Do you support the king, who offers peace under steel, at the cost of lives and voices silenced? Do you walk away, let the pieces fall where they will, and keep your blade only for monsters that do not wear crowns? The valley did not answer. It only watched. As he moved through it, choices presented themselves not with fanfare, but with stillness. A merchant needing passage through a contested road, a deserter begging for safe travel to his family, a mage offering knowledge in exchange for silence. Each decision, small on the surface, rippled outward. A road cleared meant weapons reached rebels sooner. A deserter saved meant morale broken elsewhere. A silence kept meant another power, unchecked. And still, Geralt chose. Slowly, without certainty, without guarantee. The sun never quite broke through the clouds in the Pontar Valley. Its light was always filtered, dulled, uncertain, like truth, like justice, like peace. He reached the valley's midpoint by nightfall. There, beneath a collapsed bridge, he found a small fire, tended by a boy no older than 12. The child did not speak. He only offered half a crust of bread and sat beside the Witcher without question. They ate in silence, and when the boy fell asleep, his head resting on a torn sack of grain, Geralt stared into the fire, its flame small but steady. The valley held no answers, only questions, only choices, and they waited for him still. The battlefield had long since cooled. No smoke, no cries, no clash of steel, only silence now, the kind that settles into the bones of the land, not as absence, but as residue. A stillness earned through fire, through suffering, through promises that were never truly kept. The banners that once flew proudly above camps and keeps now lay tattered in the mud, their colours faded, their symbols half forgotten. Those who once fought beneath them now scattered, some buried, some wandering, and some still pretending to serve. Geralt moved among them. He found no glory in the remains, only fragments. Swords with notches too deep to be sharpened again, armour too dented to reflect light, letters never delivered, coins stamped with the faces of kings who had already died by the time the orders were issued. This was the truth of war, not charge or conquest, but aftermath. And in that aftermath, bows bent, not broken cleanly, no rarely ever snapped in two. More often they warped, twisted slowly, adapted to new masters. Soldiers who once swore loyalty to the crown now sold their swords to whoever offered shelter and food. Knights who once rode in honour now guarded caravans of smuggled wine or stood watch for corrupt magistrates. Orders faded into necessity. Allegiance faded into survival. At the edge of the Mahakam foothills, Geralt met a group of such men. Veterans, they called themselves, though none bore the markings of a unified army anymore. Their leader, a man named Branter, wore 3 sigils on his shoulder, each from a different cause. He explained slowly that none had lasted, none had delivered what they promised, and yet he kept the patches, not out of pride, but out of memory. They invited Geralt to their fire. He sat with them in silence, accepting a bowl of thin stew, watching the flames flicker in the reflection of a dulled sword laid across a log. One man, older than most, mumbled stories half to himself, of a duel that never ended, of a commander who disappeared mid-battle, of a letter from a queen that promised reinforcements, that never arrived. Geralt did not question him. Stories like that were common, more common than truth, and often more accurate. Further along the road, he passed a village where 2 banners still flew, one from Cedwen, one from Edirn. The villagers kept both raised, not from loyalty, but from fear. Whichever army came next, they hoped to appear cooperative, neutral, invisible. They spoke in soft tones, offered bread, but no names. And Geralt understood. For in a world where rulers changed monthly, survival was not about strength, but flexibility. One had to bend, not too far, just enough not to break. Oaths had once meant something, long ago, in the days of the old knightly orders, in the halls of Kaer Morhen, when boys recited the Witcher's Code with trembling voices and wide eyes. But even there, even then, rules had bent, contracts were rewritten, monsters were spared, people were judged. Nothing remained pure. In Virgin, the resistance fractured further. The council, once unified behind Saskia's image, now whispered different paths. Some called for negotiations, others for independence at any cost. None could agree, and each accused the others of betrayal. Geralt watched. He offered no sides, only questions. And the answers always circled back to fear. In Kedwen, Henselt's circle drew tighter. He no longer trusted his advisors. He suspected plots, spies, poisons, and perhaps rightly so. For each ally seemed just a little too loyal, each message just a little too delayed. Geralt stood in his presence once more, and saw not a king, but a man trapped in a chair too large for comfort. He wore his crown like a man wears armor he never chose, and even he spoke of oaths, of men he trusted who no longer answered calls, of treaties rewritten by interpreters, of promises made to dead kings that no longer served the living. Across the land, a sickness lingered, not one of flesh, but of belief, in symbols, in banners, in oaths. And yet, some still tried. A young woman in Temeria carried her family's banner, hand-stitched, from village to village, reciting the lineage of her fallen house, seeking those who still remembered. She did not ask for coin, only acknowledgement. Her voice shook, but she spoke anyway. Geralt listened, not because he believed the words would save the land, but because someone still believed they might. That was worth something, even in a world of broken banners and bent oaths. Thrones are cold things on the surface, carved from stone, polished wood, or forged metal. But they rest, always, above heat. The fire beneath the throne is not made of flame or coal. It is made of ambition, of fear, of memory. It is the simmering unrest that sustains power, even as it threatens to consume it. And it is never still. Every ruler who sits upon a throne, no matter how composed, no matter how rightful, no matter how beloved, knows of this fire. They feel it not on their skin, but in the stillness between decrees, in the silence after the applause, in the breath held when a door creaks open without warning. King Radovid of Redania understood this better than most. His eyes were never still. They flicked like torchlight in a draught, always watching, always calculating. He trusted no one, not because he was paranoid, but because he could not afford to be wrong. His father had ruled with strength. Radovid ruled with survival. And when he looked into the mirror each morning, he did not see a man of destiny. He saw a man surrounded. The court around him was quiet, too quiet. The nobles spoke in rehearsed tones, never truly saying what they meant. The sorcerers who once sat beside him were now exiled, executed, or simply missing. His advisors brought reports, not solutions, and each petition submitted to the throne came wrapped in careful language, as though truth itself were too dangerous to speak aloud. Geralt entered Redania's capital with no fanfare. He did not wear colours. He did not announce himself. He passed the guards, who barely registered him, and stood before the palace gates as though summoned not by invitation, but by inevitability. The guards let him through, not with confidence, but with the cautious respect granted to weapons one cannot control. Radovid met him not in the hall, but in a private chamber. A map lay open before the king. Its ink was smudged from overuse. Borders had been redrawn, scratched out, redrawn again. Tokens representing armies were placed not to strategize, but to guess, to anticipate movements no longer bound by logic. "You've seen more than most," the king said, without looking up. "Tell me, Witcher, how does it all end?" Geralt did not answer, because there was no answer, not yet. Radovid leaned back, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. "They all think they know. The Lodge, the Nilfgaardians, the rebels, even the gods if they still listen. But none of them understand the fire, not like I do." Geralt remained still. Radovid's gaze settled on him. "You think me mad." "I think you're afraid," Geralt replied softly. Radovid smiled, not in humor, but in acknowledgement. "Good. Fear is fuel. It feeds the fire, keeps it burning. Makes sure I never sleep too long, never trust too easily." Beneath the palace, rumors whispered of secret prisons, of chambers filled with silence, not screams, of men and women who once held power, now unremembered by all but their jailers. Radovid called them precautions. Others called them warnings. And yet, even here, even now, the fire beneath his throne had grown restless. Unrest stirred in the lower quarters. Merchants grumbled of taxes. Soldiers muttered of unpaid wages. Spies reported whispers of rebellion, not organized, not yet, but real, persistent, slow. In the gardens outside the palace, where roses no longer bloomed, Geralt met an old servant tending dry soil. The man did not bow. He only asked if the Witcher remembered the king's mother, how she used to walk here every morning, before the court awoke. She had spoken to the gardener often, said the roses would bloom again someday. She believed it. No one else had touched the soil since she died. Now only weeds remained. Geralt walked the garden path slowly. There was no danger here, only memory. But even memory could burn. Before he left the capital, he watched Radovid from a distance, standing alone at the palace balcony, looking not over his people, but toward the horizon, toward Nilfgaard, toward the great unknown. There was no warmth in him, only fire. And fire, when left uncontained, eventually consumes its own source.